Good morning. I'm Representative Chris Hall from Sioux City. I'm here to discuss the bill that the House of Representatives will be sending down to the governor's office this afternoon. It was the supplemental appropriation for workforce development offices. This was recently passed out of the Senate, and today we will also be discussing it in the House. In a bipartisan way, we have reached an agreement that will provide $8.67 million to workforce development offices to keep them open through the remainder of fiscal year 12. This is good work. It's what people throughout Iowa, people in my district, are clamoring for. When given a limited timeline and at the fallout of the veto and the ruling by the Supreme Court, we have put together legislation that provides supplemental funding to those offices to keep them open and to keep them open in critical areas. It's something that will provide people who are unemployed or underemployed and looking for work the opportunity to meet face-to-face with somebody to look for better options in the workforce development field. And I believe that today, when we send this down to the governor's office, it will provide some conclusion to what we need for the fiscal year 12 budget. I think that there may be future discussions about where workforce development offices will continue to go in the fiscal year 13, but for today's purposes, I think that this is a great example of bipartisan work and something that we can be proud of, given the limited timeline and the absolute necessity to send something forward which will keep those offices open and functioning for Iowans throughout the state.
I think that was a good effort. I just echo his points. When a problem's presented and the legislature is able to take it up and work together and come up with a solution, I think that's good work. That's the process we're in here. We're at that stage in the process where most of the budget bills have been. Both sides have established their position. The Senate has a budget position. The House has a budget position, and now is the time of the session when we should start getting bills into conference committee. As you know, last year there was some resistance to putting bills in conference committee, and so in June, at a certain point, we were able to, on one day, move 4 bills into conference committee. Within 36 hours of that action, 4 out of 4 of those bills had resolution. We think it makes sense this year to get at that a little bit earlier. So we're hopeful next week we'll begin moving bills into conference committee, move maybe half the bills into conference committee, and start the process of reaching resolution on that. That is the process when there's strong disagreement between two chambers on a bill, to get in a room together and talk to each other in a public way about what the differences are between the House version and the Senate version, go through that, and then look for common ground, as we did on the bill on workforce development centers. So that's going to be our direction next week, is getting those bills to conference committee.
Do you think Republicans in the House have actually established their position? However, that throughout all these budget debates, we're hearing that these are starting positions for their money, and is that what do you make of that?
I can address that. They're not real, and so I am from the House side very pessimistic that we'll be able to get out of here in a timely fashion. For those of you that covered the legislature in the past, you know that next week, this is the second to the last week, we're supposed to have the so-called boxes put out, where the pages get to draw pictures on them and they assign them to a legislator, and the legislature start organizing their materials as we prepare to shut down. We are not in a position to send a single solitary budget bill to the governor. The numbers that the House Republicans have are absurd. The House Democrats are closer in almost every case to where Governor Branstad is at than we are with the House Republicans. If someone could wave a magic wand and say the House Republicans were taken out of the equation, and we'd have a fairly quick shutdown, as Senator Gronstal just alluded to, because it's pretty clear that we can work with the Senate Democrats, Senate Republicans, and Governor Branstad to find compromise. I don't think they're even close on votes on the Department of Human Services budget to bring it up for debate. They're tremendously, is that a word? Tremendously. They are in a tremendous fashion lower than where the governor's at, where we think is appropriate. The education bill, we're well over $100 million below where the governor and we think we need to be. The economic development proposals, we're only $5 million different, House Democrats with the governor. Republicans are at 0 for the economic development fund issue. None of those are resolved, yet alone getting into education reform and what that's going to look like and what the governor's going to demand to have with regard to that. I think we're closer in many ways with Senate Democrats and some of the Republicans on that issue, but that's a global issue that's separate from the budget issues we haven't resolved yet. Mental health reform, developmental disability redesign, huge issue. How's the funding going to work on that? And commercial property tax relief. So to do all the budget bills, tackle all 3 of those major issues, and start filling up the boxes starting next week as we go into the final week. I don't see how we're going to get out of here on time, and I hope so. We're ready to work in a bipartisan fashion, but I think we are a long way away from getting out of here on time.
Well, do you feel like you know what the Republican numbers are, given
No.
what they've said?
No, because they admit these is a starting point. We know this is not where we need to be. Representative Heaton, the chair of the Human Services budget, harshly criticized the very budget he was moving out of the Appropriations Committee is unacceptable. And that's so. I guess the idea is that we'll get it in the conference committee and start to work through these differences. But we've wasted a lot of time on really bills that are not legitimate by their own admission.
Just to be clear, Representative McCarthy, you're saying that you think that, I understand about Representative Heaton criticizing his own bill. Same thing happened on the education bill and some others. But,
Yes.
But you are actually saying you think they don't have the votes for their human services budget?
Correct.
Senator Gronstal, would you be sending the property tax issue to conference committee?
We will, we're continuing to have productive discussions with the executive branch and with House people about the property tax bill. So I'd say that's still a work in progress. At some point it may end up in conference committee. At some point we may come to an agreement. So we'll see how that goes.
But you just laid out a scenario about how effective conference committees are in resolving issues quickly. That one's been sitting around forever. Why don't you resolve that one quickly?
And that may in fact be what we do. I'm trying to work in good faith with the executive branch and with the concerns that the House has raised about our bill, and we'll go through that. We continue to think it's an important issue that we would really like to get done. Some property tax relief, in particular for businesses in this state. We think that's very important. So we'd like to get that done. We don't think a tax shift is the solution. Asking other people to pay higher property taxes so some people can pay less, we don't think that's a very good solution. That's what the House bill does.
Senator Gronstal, is that a must-do? You said you like it. Is that a must-do?
I would sincerely like to get something done on that subject. I think that's a very important issue. I think it's good for Iowa. I think it could help create jobs, especially on Main Street and for small businesses in this state. I'd really like to get something done. If it involves me raising somebody else's taxes so I can lower those, I'm not a big fan of that. That's what's wrong with the governor's plan and the House plan.
Local radio station, the governor has threatened to bring you back to special session if you don't pass a property tax bill. Does he express that to you, that if you don't?
I'm not going to respond to those kinds of suggestions.
Do you share Representative McCarthy's pessimism on how quickly this section can be shut down?
I'm really serious about this. Last year, we went through a process where we kind of stopped. We tried kind of internally to negotiate our differences. We both tried to make some case to the public about why our budget priorities were better than their budget priorities. They tried to do the same kind of a thing, but we weren't in one room talking together with each other. When we moved bills to conference committee, we moved 4, I think on a Wednesday, moved 4 bills to conference committee, and 36 hours later, 4 out of 4 had agreement. We think that's the model. We think that's why we have conference committees. We think if you look at parliamentary bodies and that's how two chambers with strong differences resolve those differences, getting into the same room with the same people and talking those things out in public. We think that's the solution to these differences, and it's a time honored. I mean, if you look at the structure of governments across the world, that's how it works. Two bodies get together in a conference committee.
To what extent does meeting these big initiatives like the property tax and school education reform center around getting the budget solved first?
They don't.
Nothing.
Not in my view. There are a set of things we should do. There's one absolute critical thing the legislature must do every year, and that's pass a budget. And then there are a whole bunch of things that would be really good for the state of Iowa, for job creation, for improving education, for delivering better mental health services. There's a whole set of other things we would really like to get done. But the one mission that's demanded of the state legislature every year is to pass a budget.
One dynamic that I didn't mention, but I think is causing some of the issues on the House side, there are only 46 returning members of the Republican Majority Caucus on the House. There's 11 or 12 of those returning members that are being primaried from the right. Put this in perspective, 1 out of every 4 of their returning members has a primary from the right. Going into the June primary, which is coming up here in just a couple months, what is it better? What's better for those members that are being primaried from the right? Compromising with Democrats and moving to the center and governing in the mainstream fashion, or showing your right-wing bona fides to your Republican primary voting base when you're being primaried from the right? I'm not asserting that any one individual legislator is putting politics before policy, but I do believe it's a political strain on approximately a quarter of their returning members.
Participating in the infrastructure debate, Lieutenant Peterson talked a little bit about money, federal money that was supposed to be used for hungry kids to be used for infrastructure instead. Do you know anything about that?
No.
Nuclear power, any movement on that, or are we going to see that come up at the Senate floor anytime soon?
Don't know.
And gas tax, is that completely off the table?
I don't really know. Listen, I think there still is a critical mass of legislators in all 4 caucuses that are interested in that. So those discussions are ongoing. Whether that critical mass is enough kind of remains to be seen.
That's the same on nuclear, discussions are ongoing with that.
I'm not going to use that phrase in connection with nuclear. So
Schools and dealing with.
that was a joke. Critical mass. Okay.
Schools in dealing with budget cuts have often laid off music teachers and art teachers. If you require music and arts to be part of the core curriculum in a greater degree, do schools have the capacity to provide those classes given the staff that they have?
We continue to believe it is a mistake to be talking about improving education and results in this state and asking schools and teachers and students to do more when we're unwilling to even tell them what their budget might be next year. The law requires us to set allowable growth a year in advance, and the Republicans are content with 0% allowable growth. We think that's a serious mistake.
Will that issue be resolved before you leave? The allowable growth issue for FY14?
Well, it'll be resolved before we leave, but I don't know which way. It may be resolved with 0, and I think that's incredibly unfortunate.
0 by passing something that says 0, or 0 by not doing anything?
I think it's unlikely the Republicans in the House will obey the current law that requires them to set it.
Is the mental health redesign needed more difficult?
I actually think people are making real progress on that. There was a meeting this morning of key players, I think, from all 4 caucuses, and I think there's a lot of consensus developing around that. I'm very hopeful we'll get something done.
Even on the budget issue, the property tax levy?
I think they're having those discussions, and like I say, I think I'm really hopeful we can get something done on that.
You've been in the legislature obviously a number of years. Your prediction at this point, are you going to go home and
A week
just
from
finish the budget and then go home, or
a week from next
accomplish?
Thursday. So
A week from next Thursday.
Yeah.
Are you going to be able to accomplish some of these big issues before?
I hope so.
Pass the budget?
I hope so.
Percentage-wise, what would you give it?
I keep saying to people, it's about common ground. You know, I'm ready, willing, and able the moment we get done here to go out and campaign for re-election. And campaigning for re-election is about where you differ with your opponents. That's the focus of an election. The focus of governing isn't about where you disagree, it's about where you agree. It's about common ground. It's about working together. It's about saying, okay, I guess on that one, we disagree. We can't reach resolution on that, so be it. But there's a host of areas where there is strong agreement, and that's what we really ought to focus on. So whether it's mental health reform or education reform or an appropriate budget for the Department of Economic Development, all of those things, I think there's enough common ground to be had that we don't have to come to loggerheads over it. It's time for us to work together, and the process for doing that is getting bills into conference committee.